The laughter echoed through the marble corridors of the Pinnacle Tower as Saeed Al Mansouri held up an ancient leather-bound manuscript, its pages yellowed with age and covered in intricate Arabic calligraphy that seemed to dance across the parchment like forgotten secrets waiting to be unlocked. "I'll give $1 million to anyone in this building who can translate this properly," he announced with the kind of cruel amusement that wealthy people often derived from displaying their superiority over those they considered intellectually inferior. The challenge was delivered to a room full of investment bankers, corporate lawyers, and technology executives who had gathered for the building's annual charity auction. But what Saeed didn't know was that Fatima Johnson, the cleaning lady who was quietly emptying trash cans in the corner, possessed a PhD in classical Arabic literature from Al-Azhar University and could read the manuscript as easily as he could read a newspaper, though her circumstances had forced her to hide her extraordinary education behind the invisible uniform of a service worker. The manuscript that Saeed waved mockingly above his head was a 13th-century treatise on advanced mathematics and astronomy, written by one of the greatest scholars of the Islamic Golden Age. But he had acquired it not through appreciation for its intellectual content, but as another trophy to display in his collection of expensive artifacts that demonstrated his wealth rather than his wisdom. His family's oil fortune had provided him with the means to purchase priceless historical documents, but not the education or cultural sensitivity to understand their true significance beyond their monetary value on the international antiquities market. Saeed's relationship with his own cultural heritage was complicated by his desperate desire to gain acceptance among Western elites, who valued him primarily for his financial resources rather than his understanding of Islamic civilization. He had spent years distancing himself from what he perceived as the backward traditions of his ancestors, preferring to collect their artifacts as expensive curiosities rather than engage with their intellectual achievements as sources of pride and cultural identity. The irony of his situation was particularly painful because the manuscript he was mocking represented exactly the kind of scholarly tradition that had made Islamic civilization one of the most intellectually advanced societies in human history, producing innovations in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that had provided the foundation for later European developments during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. The charity event was supposed to raise money for educational programs serving underprivileged communities, but Saeed's participation was motivated entirely by the tax benefits and social connections that such philanthropy provided, rather than genuine concern for the people who would supposedly benefit from his donations. His challenge to translate the Arabic text was intended as entertainment for his wealthy peers, who shared his assumption that the service workers moving invisibly through their gathering possessed neither the education nor the cultural background necessary to comprehend sophisticated Islamic scholarship. The gathering represented the pinnacle of American financial and professional achievement, with attendees who controlled billions of dollars in assets and influenced economic policies that affected millions of people around the world. Yet their collective ignorance about Islamic intellectual history and their casual dismissal of Arabic scholarship revealed the cultural blindness that often accompanied extreme wealth and social privilege. Fatima had been working the night cleaning shift at Pinnacle Tower for 3 years, arriving each evening after most of the building's occupants had departed, and laboring until dawn to maintain the pristine environment that wealthy tenants expected but rarely acknowledged. Her colleagues in the cleaning crew knew her as a reliable and hardworking woman who spoke little about her background, but none of them suspected that she held advanced degrees in Arabic literature, Islamic history, and comparative religion from one of the most prestigious universities in the Muslim world. The path that had led from academic achievement to janitorial work was a familiar story of credential recognition barriers, economic necessity, and systemic discrimination that prevented many highly educated immigrants from accessing employment opportunities that matched their qualifications. Fatima's degrees were not recognized by American institutions without expensive and time-consuming validation processes that required resources she could not afford, while supporting 3 children as a single mother, forcing her to accept whatever work was available, regardless of how it utilized or wasted her intellectual capabilities. Her journey to America had begun with hopes of pursuing advanced research and teaching opportunities that would allow her to contribute to cross-cultural understanding and Islamic scholarship, but the reality of immigrant life had forced her to prioritize survival over intellectual fulfillment, creating the kind of brain waste that impoverished American society while destroying individual potential. The cleaning uniform that she wore each night represented not just economic necessity, but also social invisibility, because American society had trained wealthy people to ignore service workers as background figures whose inner lives, educational achievements, and intellectual capabilities were irrelevant to the important business of wealth creation and social networking. The irony of her situation was particularly painful because she was cleaning the offices of people whose understanding of Middle Eastern culture and Islamic civilization was limited to stereotypes and misconceptions, while she possessed deep scholarly knowledge of the very traditions they claimed to respect when it served their business interests in oil-rich regions of the world. Her expertise in classical Arabic texts, medieval Islamic philosophy, and comparative religious studies remained hidden behind the social invisibility that American society imposed on working-class immigrants whose contributions were valued only for their labor rather than their intellectual potential. Come on. Surely someone here studied Arabic in college. Saeed continued, his voice dripping with condescension as he surveyed the room full of wealthy professionals who had been educated at elite institutions but had never encountered genuine scholarship from the Islamic world. This is supposed to be some kind of important historical document, but I'm betting it's just poetry or religious nonsense that these medieval Arabs thought was profound. The dismissive characterization of Islamic scholarship as nonsense revealed not only Saeed's ignorance about his own cultural heritage, but also the internalized prejudice that led him to diminish the intellectual achievements of his ancestors in order to gain acceptance among Western elites who valued him primarily for his oil wealth, rather than his understanding of the civilization that had produced some of history's greatest advances in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. His comments reflected the kind of cultural self-hatred that wealthy immigrants sometimes developed when seeking acceptance in societies that treated their heritage as inferior or exotic, leading them to distance themselves from traditions that should have been sources of pride and connection to their historical identity. The manuscript he was mocking had been written by al-Battani, one of the most influential astronomers and mathematicians in human history, whose calculations of the solar year and lunar cycles had provided the foundation for calendar reforms that were still used in modern times, and whose trigonometric innovations had influenced European mathematical development for centuries. The text contained revolutionary insights about planetary motion and mathematical relationships that had been centuries ahead of their time, but Saeed's cultural ignorance prevented him from recognizing that he was casually dismissing intellectual achievements that surpassed anything produced by the contemporary scholars he claimed to admire. The auction house where Saeed had purchased the manuscript had marketed it as an exotic curiosity rather than a serious scholarly work, appealing to wealthy collectors who wanted to own pieces of Islamic history without understanding their intellectual or cultural significance, creating a market for cultural artifacts that treated them as decorative objects rather than repositories of human knowledge and achievement. Fatima continued her work in the corner of the room, emptying wastebaskets and wiping down surfaces, while listening to the conversation, with growing frustration about the way these wealthy people discussed Islamic culture and scholarship. Her years of advanced study had given her deep appreciation for the intellectual traditions that had flourished in the medieval Islamic world, and hearing Saeed's dismissive comments about the very heritage he should have been celebrating created anger that she struggled to suppress while maintaining her professional demeanor. The cleaning work itself was physically demanding and mentally exhausting, not because the tasks were inherently difficult, but because the social invisibility that accompanied her role required constant emotional labor to maintain dignity while being treated as if she didn't exist by people whose offices she maintained with meticulous care and professional pride. "Maybe we should try Google Translate," suggested one of the investment bankers, his comment triggering laughter from colleagues who found the idea of using basic technology to decode sophisticated historical texts amusing rather than insulting to the scholars who had produced such work without access to modern computational tools. The suggestion that machine translation could adequately render classical Arabic poetry and philosophical discourse, revealed the technological hubris that characterized contemporary approaches to cross-cultural understanding, where complex linguistic and cultural concepts were reduced to algorithmic approximations that missed nuances, metaphors, and intellectual frameworks that required deep scholarly training to interpret accurately. I doubt even Google could handle whatever backwards thinking is written in this thing, another executive added, his casual racism delivered with the confidence of someone who had never encountered intellectual challenges to his assumptions about cultural superiority and historical development. The comments about backwards thinking were particularly ironic, given that the manuscript contained mathematical innovations that had required centuries for European scholars to rediscover and develop, demonstrating the kind of intellectual sophistication that contradicted every stereotype about medieval Islamic society that these modern financiers had absorbed through inadequate education and biased media representations. Fatima's hands tightened around her cleaning supplies as she listened to the increasingly offensive characterizations of Islamic scholarship. But her experience with workplace discrimination had taught her that confronting wealthy clients about their prejudices would result in immediate termination, rather than educational enlightenment, leaving her children without the income they needed for basic survival. The economic vulnerability that forced her to remain silent in the face of cultural insults represented one of the cruelest aspects of systemic inequality, where people with knowledge and expertise were prevented from sharing their insights because doing so would threaten their ability to provide for their families through menial labor that was the only employment available to them. Perhaps the challenge is unfair, said Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, the only woman among the senior executives present, though her attempt at diplomacy was motivated more by discomfort with the public display of ignorance than genuine respect for Islamic intellectual traditions. Classical Arabic is quite specialized, and historical documents often require expert knowledge to interpret properly. The acknowledgement that the translation challenge might require actual expertise was closer to recognizing the reality of what Saeed was asking, but it was delivered in the patronizing tone that academics often used when explaining complex subjects to people they assumed were incapable of understanding sophisticated concepts. Exactly my point, Saeed replied triumphantly, as if Dr. Harrison's comment had proven his assertion that the manuscript was too difficult for ordinary people to comprehend. These old texts are impossible to understand without years of specialized training that nobody here has bothered to acquire. The irony of his statement was that someone in the room did possess exactly the specialized training he was describing, but his assumptions about the educational backgrounds of service workers prevented him from recognizing that expertise could exist in forms that challenged his expectations about how knowledge was distributed across social and economic boundaries. $1 million is quite generous for a translation, observed Marcus Chen, a technology entrepreneur whose companies had made billions through algorithmic innovations that processed human language. Although I suspect the real value is in watching people embarrass themselves trying to read something they can't possibly understand. The cruel entertainment that Marcus found in other people's potential embarrassment reflected the same lack of empathy that allowed wealthy individuals to treat service workers as invisible, while discussing subjects that might be deeply meaningful to people whose backgrounds and experiences they had never bothered to learn about or respect. Fatima had reached the limit of her ability to listen silently to the degradation of scholarship and culture that had shaped her intellectual development and spiritual understanding. The manuscript that Saeed was treating as a curiosity represented part of the intellectual heritage that had inspired her own academic pursuits and connected her to centuries of scholars who had advanced human knowledge despite facing their own challenges and limitations. "Excuse me," Fatima said quietly, her voice carrying across the room with the calm authority of someone who had spent years teaching university students and presenting research at academic conferences. "I can translate that manuscript for you." The suggestion that the cleaning lady possessed the linguistic skills necessary to read classical Arabic created immediate silence throughout the room, as wealthy executives struggled to process the possibility that someone they had been ignoring might actually possess relevant expertise for the challenge that had been stumping their supposedly superior intellects. "I'm sorry, did you just say you can read Arabic?" Saeed asked, his tone carrying disbelief mixed with amusement at what he assumed was either a misunderstanding or an attempt at humor from someone whose job responsibilities had never suggested any connection to academic scholarship or linguistic sophistication. "I can read classical Arabic, yes," Fatima replied, with the matter-of-fact tone that scholars used when stating their areas of expertise. Though she was careful to maintain the respectful demeanor that her employment required, regardless of how offensive she found the conversation that had been taking place. The claim of linguistic competence from someone in a cleaning uniform created cognitive dissonance for people whose worldview depended on clear distinctions between intellectual and manual labor, educated and uneducated workers, valuable and invisible contributors to the spaces where important decisions were made and significant wealth was managed. "This is rich," laughed James Morrison, the investment firm's managing partner, whose family name was emblazoned across the building's facade. "Our cleaning lady thinks she can read a 13th-century Arabic manuscript that would challenge university professors." The dismissive laughter that greeted Fatima's offer revealed the automatic prejudice that prevented wealthy people from recognizing expertise when it appeared in forms that contradicted their assumptions about how education intelligence were distributed across social and economic hierarchies. "I have a PhD in classical Arabic literature from Al-Azhar University," Fatima said simply, her credentials delivered without defensiveness or apology, though she understood that revealing her educational background would create complications for her employment situation, regardless of how the translation challenge was resolved. The revelation that their cleaning lady possessed a doctorate from one of the most prestigious Islamic universities in the world sent shockwaves through the assembled executives, who suddenly found themselves confronting the reality that their assumptions about service workers had been completely wrong in at least this one spectacular case. "That's impossible," Saeed said, his voice carrying the confusion of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged by information that didn't fit into his understanding of how education, wealth, and social status were supposed to correlate in American society. "I can provide documentation of my degrees if necessary," Fatima replied calmly, though she knew that credential verification would not address the underlying prejudices that had led these people to assume that cleaning workers could not possibly possess advanced education or specialized knowledge. The offer to provide proof of her academic achievements forced the wealthy executives to confront the possibility that they had been sharing their workspace with someone whose intellectual qualifications exceeded their own, despite the economic circumstances that had relegated her to janitorial work. "Well then, Dr. Harrison said, her academic background making her more willing than the others to accept the possibility that expertise could exist in unexpected places. "Perhaps you should take Mr. Al Mansouri up on his challenge." The suggestion that Fatima actually attempt the translation created a moment of tension, because success would prove that the wealthy executives had been wrong about both the difficulty of the task and the capabilities of the person they had been ignoring, while failure would confirm their prejudices and potentially humiliate someone who had revealed herself to be vulnerable to their judgment. "Yes, please do try," Saeed said, his tone carrying the confidence of someone who believed that even if Fatima possessed some Arabic language skills, she could not possibly handle the complexity of a historical manuscript that would challenge even contemporary scholars with specialized training. Fatima approached the podium where Saeed held the manuscript, her movements carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years working with similar documents and understood both their intellectual content and their historical significance. As she examined the pages, her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine excitement as she recognized the text and its importance. "This is al-Battani's treatise on solar calculations and planetary motion," she said, her voice carrying the enthusiasm that scholars felt when encountering primary source materials related to their research interests. "It's one of the most important astronomical works of the medieval period." The immediate identification of the manuscript's author and subject matter demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond basic linguistic competence to encompass deep familiarity with Islamic intellectual history and the scholarly traditions that had produced such works. "You recognize this text, Dr. Harrison asked, her academic curiosity overcoming the social awkwardness of the situation, as she realized she might be witnessing expertise that could provide valuable insights into historical scholarship. Al-Battani was one of the greatest astronomers and mathematicians in history, Fatima explained, her voice taking on the educational tone that university professors used when sharing knowledge with students who were encountering important concepts for the first time. His calculations were so accurate that they influenced European astronomy for centuries. The explanation of al-Battani's historical significance provided context that none of the wealthy executives had possessed, revealing not only Fatima's scholarly expertise, but also the cultural ignorance that had led them to dismiss Islamic intellectual achievements as worthless nonsense. The manuscript begins with astronomical observations about the solar year, Fatima continued, beginning to translate the opening passages with fluent ease that demonstrated complete mastery of classical Arabic literary style and technical vocabulary. Al-Battani is explaining how his calculations differ from those of Ptolemy, and why his measurements of the solar year are more accurate. The smooth translation of complex astronomical and mathematical concepts revealed not only linguistic competence, but deep understanding of the intellectual content that allowed Fatima to render technical discussions in terms that contemporary audiences could comprehend and appreciate. As she continued reading, translating centuries-old Arabic into clear English explanations of revolutionary astronomical insights, the wealthy executives found themselves learning about intellectual achievements that challenged their assumptions about medieval Islamic society and its contributions to human knowledge. He's describing mathematical techniques for calculating planetary positions that weren't developed in Europe until centuries later, Fatima explained, as she worked through increasingly complex passages, combined mathematical formulas with observational data and theoretical frameworks. The revelation that Islamic scholars had developed advanced mathematical techniques centuries before similar innovations appeared in European scholarship provided historical perspective that contradicted the narrative of Western intellectual superiority that had informed the executive's understanding of scientific development. This section discusses trigonometric functions and their applications to astronomical calculations, Fatima continued, her translation revealing the sophisticated mathematical content that Saeed had dismissed as religious nonsense or primitive poetry. The technical sophistication of the mathematical discussions made it clear that the manuscript represented serious scholarly work that had contributed to genuine advances in human understanding of astronomical phenomena and mathematical relationships. As Fatima completed her translation of the opening sections, providing clear English renditions of complex Arabic passages that none of the wealthy executives could have approached, the room fell silent as people processed the implications of what they had witnessed. "That was extraordinary," Dr. Harrison said finally, her academic training allowing her to appreciate the skill and knowledge that Fatima had demonstrated through her translation work. The acknowledgement of Fatima's expertise from someone with her own scholarly credentials provided validation that the translation had been accurate and sophisticated, rather than simple linguistic approximation or educated guessing. Saeed stood holding the manuscript with a completely different expression than he had worn when issuing his mocking challenge. Because the translation had revealed both the intellectual significance of the text he had been dismissing and the remarkable qualifications of the person he had been ignoring. "I believe you've earned your $1 million, he said quietly, his voice carrying genuine respect rather than the condescension that had characterized his earlier comments. The acknowledgement that Fatima had successfully met his challenge created a moment of reckoning for everyone in the room, as they confronted the reality that their assumptions about service workers, Islamic scholarship, and the distribution of expertise had been completely wrong. "I don't want your money," Fatima replied, her dignity intact despite the circumstances that had forced her to reveal her qualifications in such a public manner. "I just wanted you to understand that the text you were mocking represents one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements." The refusal to accept payment for demonstrating her expertise transformed the encounter from a simple translation challenge into a lesson about respect, cultural heritage, and the dangerous consequences of prejudice and ignorance. "What I would like," Fatima continued, "is for people to understand that Islamic civilization produced scholars whose mathematical and scientific innovations influenced human development for centuries, and that dismissing such achievements as nonsense reveals more about the ignorance of the speaker than about the value of the scholarship." The educational moment that Fatima created through her response to Saeed's challenge provided exactly the kind of cross-cultural understanding that the charity event had supposedly been designed to promote, though it had emerged through confronting prejudice rather than celebrating diversity. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to congratulate you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to check out the rest of our channel for more exciting and inspirational stories like this one. And don't forget to show your support by liking and subscribing, so this channel can reach more people just like you. Now, back to the story. Years later, when Fatima had been hired as a consulting scholar for the museum that eventually acquired the Al-Battani manuscript, she would reflect on the evening when her hidden expertise had shocked a room full of wealthy executives into recognizing that knowledge and wisdom could not be judged by economic status or social position. The cleaning lady, who had translated a 13th-century masterpiece, had taught powerful people that true intelligence often came from unexpected sources, that cultural heritage deserved respect regardless of contemporary political tensions, and that the most valuable lessons were sometimes delivered by those whom society had trained them to ignore. The $1 Million Challenge had cost Saeed nothing financially, but it had provided an education about humility, respect, and the dangers of cultural arrogance that would influence his understanding of scholarship and human potential for the rest of his life.